Okay, we are going to talk just a little bit about sound. This part of acoustical engineering and part of acoustics, that let's just approach it from let's understand the basics. Everything that I speak about here, I expect you to branch out on some and take a look around and dig around a little bit, to improve your knowledge of what sound is. Sound is such a beautiful, wonderful thing. Let's just talk about the basic components. First of all, the basic components is, the most basic component is a sinusoid. So you have a sinusoid and its cycles. The basic concept there is that, a sinusoid at 20 hertz is going to have 20 cycles per second, and it's going to go up and up and up so many cycles per second. Whereas 20,000 hertz is going to have 20,000 cycles per second. And, then that's going to determine the frequency. So each sinusoid is representative of a frequency. Now, so with those basic components, that, what's going to be, add more components is going to be other sinusoids. So, is one thing that you have to kind of understand about that is when you're dealing with other components of of timbres, is that, you've got overtones and harmonics. First overtone is the second harmonic, second overtone is the third harmonic, and so on and so forth from the fundamental frequency that's creating the timbre. Odd harmonics and even numbered harmonics are really, the combinations of those two, or having them combined together, is going to greatly influence the sound of what's happening. And you can also have non-harmonic distortions, which, non-harmonic distortions are harmonics that are not supposed to be inside of the timbre you're dealing with. So whenever you come to a harmonic distortion, any harmonics that are inside of this timbre and this sound that are unwanted or that you don't want there are harmonic distortions. And those concepts are fairly easy to understand. And the more sinusoids you get, two sinusoids are going to cause a complex waveform or a polar waveform, which is going to be, so here's three sinusoids here, and the complex waveform or polar waveform that it's produced from their combination. And the phase of them will affect what that waveform looks also. Phase being that, where in relation to zero that the actual waveform starts, so that if it's starting here, or if it's starting in degrees farther up this way or degrees down below, that's going to have a huge impact on what the polar waveform looks like, because these same sounds with these phases of these sinusoids at different phases, at different degrees, up or down, is going to change the way this looks, but might not affect the sound of the actual instrument, and most of the time does not. So that's, and with the basic components, like, you have the basic components of the audio, which are, or any basic waveform, like a sine wave, which is one sinusoid, the square wave, sawtooth wave, or a pulse, or a square, or pulse wave, that the actual, harmonics that are contained within there to produce that sound, and at what decibel levels. Most of the time, these basic waveforms do not have any frequency modulation or volume modulation, so you normally don't have to worry about that too much when you're dealing with the basic waveforms. And that's the basic components of them. A lot of times when you're dealing with even and odd harmonics in a combination, that they won't look as sterile as when you see them on paper. Like here's an example of a sawtooth wave and a square wave, and a lot of times what its actual representation is as you start combining the harmonics that are part of that sound. And the other aspect that we just talked about a little bit is frequency modulation, meaning the frequency going back and forth and up and down a little bit. The frequency, if you look at a spectrogram and here's the frequency, it modulating back and forth some. Frequency modulation. And, and volume, decibel modulation. Those two modulations can be a huge part of sound. and varying degrees of them. So those are all very key components of sound, because a timbre, basically when you're looking at any kind of a timbre, that you have a combination of harmonics, and it can be harmonic content, non-harmonic content, then it can be harmonic distortion in it, there can be noise in it, all kinds of things. Noise is a very pertinent part of sound, being that noise most of the time is full spectrum. I mean, it's crossed all the whole audio perceived spectrum of what you can hear is noise. White noise is everywhere. Pink noise, you start bouncing electrons around in circuitry, that all of a sudden you start getting pink noise, and different types of noise from that can be mixed in with the distortion. And the distortion in that aspect being overdriving the amperage capabilities of a circuit, or overdriving the speed capabilities of that circuit, that are going to both produce different types of waveforms. Overdriving the amperage capabilities are going to be varying degrees of a square wave. Overdriving the speed capabilities are going to be varying degrees of a triangle or sawtooth wave. And different timbres are going to represent that. If you listen to like a violin and the nice sound of a violin, how the violin has a nice tone to it, and it's got a really smooth sound. And if you look at its timbre, it's really, it's really looking a lot like a triangle wave, and triangle wave is, gets represented most of the time in audio, or it used to. Now that software, it's not as much, but overdriving the speed capabilities of the circuit. So you're trying to figure out how to get that nice smooth sound in your audio, or a nice smooth distortion or saturation by combining noise and distortion to get a nice silky sound. There's a good place to start. But I don't want to get too far off subject to what we're talking about of just sound. So those combinations of those harmonics are going to make that sound, and those components are going to be part of it. Phase can be a huge part of the sound also, but when you're dealing with one timbre, a lot of times you might not be having to deal with that a lot. When you're trying to combine two sounds or two different timbres, the phase can become a huge issue, that they start canceling each other out. Or if you looked at the other video in this series about cancellation interference, when they start interfering with each other and start in varying degrees of canceling each other out and dropping the decibel level of the combination of those waveforms because of the differences in phase. And that's something to very much take into consideration. And the other aspect is hearing it and reproducing it. Hearing it and reproducing it, that it's a huge thing, so, and you have the equal loudness contours of how you're hearing it. So that the whole aspect of it, that, you've plucked the string with a pick. The pick was the first reactant, and then you have the string that's acoustically creating sound from being plucked, would be from its properties, and then it's going out in the air and propagating. Then it's hitting, your ear, which has this microphone as an ear that's going to pick it up different than something else, and then it's going to get its interpretation is going to be the effect that you perceive in your brain. So the perception of all the sound that happens is the end result of the study, how your brain perceives sound and all the things that happen to sound. And so that's and also how the speaker plays it. That speaker has that response, that speaker sounds that way, and why it does. What are the causes of the causes of the sound that comes out of it? What's causing that to happen? Those are very pertinent things. Another aspect is the envelope of the sound, the attack, decay, sustain, and release of the sound. It's something very pertinent that you need to really take into consideration in all aspects of dealing with sound. And so most of the things that I've tried to address here have been very simple and very basic. Phase is another thing, that you really need to look into, because phase cancellation, different degrees of phase cancellation, interference like we talked about in the last video or the video before that, and complete phase cancellation or partial cancellation, because the problem is when you're mixing two sinusoids, that we talked about, interference is one of the properties of acoustics that under research is interference. And that cause of interference is something to very much take into consideration when you're dealing with sound, especially if you're recording, mixing, and mastering audio. And one of the other things that I want to address real quick is like mastering. The problem with sound is analogous. And when you're dealing with it in the DAW, it becomes digital. So, you know, an understanding of discrete time and discrete sounds and discrete representation in binary form, what that's doing to the sound is very important for you to investigate, because it is another propagating entity and something else in the signal flow that is actually affecting the sound, just as if you were, I put my hands up here and I start talking like that. I mean, that's a drastic example, but it's possible that a whole lot of things in there can affect it. And especially an example is truncating audio for an MP3, that it's lossy format. You just cut out all kinds of stuff that was very important when you were mixing the audio, and it's gone, so, that's those kind of things that's another discrete time. And discrete signals are something you really want to look into and what it's doing to sound, because it's not analogous anymore in your DAW. It's hit your DAC and your ADC and your DAC. Now all of a sudden your waveform and your analogous sound is in a totally different form that can be affected in a lot of different ways that are going to be part of the acoustics and sound and what it's doing to it. So you really want to kind of look into that. So I hope that I addressed some of the basic here, because, a whole lot of that stuff's going to have a big, huge impact on you. I mean, a real simple example can be, sound sculpting, sound sculpting and frequency sculpting, volume sculpting, periodic and quasi-periodic waveforms and what you're doing with them. And, all those things can have a huge impact on, on how you perceive sound, because, you're going to interrelate that acoustician and that audio engineer kind of things together when you're mixing, because, and a simple example of that is you realized in your mix that synth sound with just a few of those harmonics at a lower end with some higher end harmonics, on top of it in the background of this section, is really filled it out and just made it smooth and cool. And it was awesome, dude. I mean, it saved that whole mix. I mean, you basically crossed the line from audio engineer into acoustician right there, and because you had the understanding of what was happening in the audio and the frequencies and the harmonic content, and approached it as a way of introducing new sounds into what was going on to enhance it or better it or repair things or smooth things out. So that's something very much to take into consideration. But I hope I addressed the basics here, and there's might probably be a whole lot of things I didn't. It's a 12-15 minute video that I'm trying to hit just the basics so that you can dig around on there and, go look around on complex waveforms that are a combination of sinusoids, and how it might look different with phase, and, I'm hopefully that if you've watched all the videos in this series so far, or if you watched all the videos on this channel, that you should have a pretty good understanding of most of these concepts and what's happening with them, and probably a fairly in-depth understanding. So I just wanted to approach sound from that perspective, and just a real basic outline of it, of what sound is, and from the perspective of most of the time probably what you're looking at it as and what you're dealing with. So I hope that was very helpful, and you could understand that its role in acoustics and what the study is. The study can be very in-depth about all what sound does and how sound's affected and how sound's perceived and how sound's projected, so that you're dealing with how's your microphone perceiving it different than your ear, that, the frequency response from it, or how the speakers are projecting it different than the other speakers, or how this is affecting the sound, or how's this circuit or this piece of software or something else affecting the sound, and have an understanding of what is happening to the harmonic content, the noise, and the ADSR and everything else that's a part of that sound, how it's been affected in all those different areas. And that's just kind of a basic outline of the study. So I hope that opened up some doors for you and helped you understand acoustics a little bit better. Peace, hope, love.